Well, good evening and welcome to, we're doing our three-part series on creation. So you heard kind of the setup last week, and so it's my job that I get to defend a young earth standpoint. And so tonight we're going to look at how can the earth possibly be 6,000 years old. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard that. Oftentimes, especially by the scientific community, it's often laughed at and completely kind of debunked and everything like that. But at the same time, there's a lot of questions that I think as Christians we can have, because there are a lot of questions that science cannot answer. And so, to frame all this argument that I have for you tonight, we need to look at something that none of you thought of when you walked in or when you clicked on this tab. It is hermeneutics. So, I know, you're exactly what you're thinking, right? So what is hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is a method or principle of interpretation. Basically, it's concerned with the ways in which humans derive meaning. So it's basically your preconceived beliefs dictate how you approach interpretation. Does that make sense? So let's take the word, I was thinking hard about a good example for this. So if I was going to say my partner, what is the thing that would jump into your mind? Now, if you are someone who is very much into the Old West, you might think it could be a friend. You remember the whole howdy partner and everything like that? That is the way people talked. It was the way that that word was commonly used. And if that is something that's near and dear to your heart, that might be the first place your mind goes to. Maybe you're someone who owns a small business, or you and someone else own a couple businesses, and so therefore you might think like a business partner or something for it. If you lean towards the LGBT community, you might think partner, you might think you're a gay lover of some sort, right? It all depends on how you approach it and how you go. Now, for you to investigate that is another story. But the important part to understand is that it's all about approach. It's all about how we approach things. It's all about how we approach it to interpret what I mean. And so in this case, approach it by the word partner. That'd be a question in which probably I'm going to, if you know me, refer to it as my friend and not necessarily my wife, or I don't own a business, so I don't have a partner. If that makes sense. So, with that all said, I hope that kind of makes sense, because a lot of what we're talking about tonight has to do with how we approach interpretation. And I think that's so very important, and I hope to walk you through this to kind of get to where I understand this. So, whether or not we like it, I coined the term because I haven't seen it anywhere else, but there's something I'm going to refer to as scientific hermeneutics. And what I mean by this is that it all depends on how you approach the science. The approaches by the world in a scientific mindset. The world, as we think about it, right? Whether you go to whatever public school you go to, whatever science is being taught, is always going to be approached from a scientific mindset. It's applying that scientific method to a worldview to have an understanding. So, what I mean by that, let's kind of take a step back here for a second. Think about it, right? Say I wake up in the morning and it's bright outside. Now, there are a couple reasons why it could be bright outside. Number one, it could be Armageddon and the end of the world is happening, and so there's big flashes everywhere. It could be a nuclear strike of some sort, or it could just be the sun came up. And so what do you do to kind of test this and understand this? Well, you walk outside and realize that Jesus hasn't come back and no one's dropping bombs. So therefore, and you see the sun rising up and you go, okay. And so we approach it from the standpoint of what do I think is out there, what is happening, and applying the scientific method to this. And so this is how, whether we realize it or not, especially in the West, this is how we are programmed. And it is not a bad thing. It's actually a relatively good thing for us to be thinking critically through these things and figuring out what we can test. So with that said, well, I want to talk to you about the scientific method here for a second. So the scientific method, if you're not familiar with it, is the process taking to produce reliable results to answer a question. So it's the process in which you take to produce some sort of thing that you can kind of figure out, wrap your hands around, whether some sort of data of some sort, to answer a question. So again, going to like the sun coming up on the outside, well, what's the best way to kind of produce these reliable results? If I walk outside and I stare at the sun, hey, you know, like you can kind of tell and see that. Now you should never stare at the sun, that's a free one. So, what we need to do then within the scientific method, there are basically 5 things. There's observation, research, hypothesis, experiment, and conclusion. So observations, what we in the scientific community was understood by that is that we should look at what our 5 senses can kind of figure out. What I can see, what I can touch, what I can taste, what I can smell. Relying on our senses to be able to kind of make observations about things. Then what we do is we create a hypothesis. So if I observe something, I might see something and I'll look at it and say, you know what? I believe a cat is actually a robot of some sort, and that's why it makes a weird purring sound. Now, that's ridiculous, obviously. Now, how would I then go ahead? And so what I observe in that situation is I observe a cat making a sound. So then I go to a hypothesis, which is, I think because this cat is making this sound, and it sounds like something I've heard before, therefore I'm going to say, I believe that a cat is a robot meant for evil domination of the world. Now, I'm just kidding. I don't really love cats very much, if you can tell. So, anyway, if you love cats, put it in the comment section. Tell me how I'm wrong. Anyway, so.
Change your mind.
So, yes, change my mind. Anyway, so this is, but here's the thing. We talk about these statements all the time, and oftentimes we refer to those as theory, but it's not a theory, and I'll get there in a second to what that looks like. And so what we're doing is we're looking at what we would call qualitative data and quantitative data. Qualitative data will be what we can observe, what we can see, what we can understand. Basically, if you're going to look outside and say, outside I see a road, it's a whole bunch of pavement, I see multiple cars going by. I just saw as I look out the window just now, I saw a car transporting something. These are things that I can observe. I can say because of the amount of cars going by, I can say it's a busy road. And how do I kind of figure that out? How do I make that assumption? Well, it's quantitative. I might count the number of cars that go by the road per minute and have to basically say, because there's so many cars going by that road in a minute, therefore I might say this is a very busy road. I might say because of the width of the road and how many lanes there are. We have a 6-lane road outside the church right here. That it's going to be a busy road, and these are things that I can quantitatively put down. There are 6 lanes. There are this many cars that go by. So that makes sense. So you have things that we observe, and there's things that we can count. And this is important, and I'll kind of make this all make sense here in a second. And so then what we have is independent variables. These are things that you can change versus dependent variables, things that you can measure. So what I mean by that is I can take a situation or hypothesis. So let's go back to that weird cat example I used. Why? It popped into my head, probably because something I saw on a YouTube video at some point in time in the last 3 days. I blame them. Anyways, with that said, I wish I could give credit. I watched a lot, don't know where it came from. I can sit there and I can make this hypothesis saying this cat does this, right? So now I can observe the cat's mannerism. Does the cat look like it works like a robot? Well, no, I can talk about how it looks more like an animal and talk about what those things are. But then I have to measure it, right? So that way you might have to, do some dissection and look for mechanical parts on the inside and count them. Not a great example. I regret my life choices, okay? But I hope you kind of understand what we're going through. And so basically what we're looking for is things that we can measure, right? If I look at that road outside, I might say, I believe that road is a busy road. What I can do is I can look and observe, and I can even change things about that road to say, if no cars came down it, how busy would it look versus how many cars, if I took away things, how many cars would come down that. And then there's the quantitative data, which is how am I counting. So there are independent variables, which is things you can change, and there's dependent variables, things that you can measure. And all this is to say, as I walk you through this, and I hope this will be really helpful, because you came here expecting to hear me talk about creation. Instead, I'm walking you through the scientific method. This is all very important, because we have to understand how the world works and how the world views things, and try to take it on their level to help explain how we see the world. So with that said, there are things. So one of the things you'll have is within your experiment, you'll have an experimental group, and you'll have a control group. So as you're running your experiment, one of the things you're going to have things that you're going to test, and you're going to have things that you're not going to test. I remember one time I was studying to be a physical therapist. I remember one of the worst labs I ever had to do was I had to measure bacteria growth of different bacteria. And so what I had to do is I had to set up, for each test, I had to test the bacteria. I had to have 3 samples. But for every 3 samples, I had to have 3 controls things. So I had to eventually, in a 3-hour lab, I had to set up like 60, me and my lab partner had set up 60 test tubes. It was awful. Took forever. I was miserable because of how much time it took. But the point being is this, is that I had a control, which basically was, does that bacteria grow? What am I watching? Well, a control sample would be, oh hey, this came from the same mixture that I'm going to try to grow bacteria in. If there's a contaminant, if I don't do anything to that control and let it grow, then I see that there's a problem. Is everybody kind of working with me? Really what it is you want to leave something aside to basically say, if I do nothing to it, what happens? And if I do something to it, what happens? Therefore, just because if I was to leave something and then kind of go with it. So let me give you an example for it. Everybody likes bananas. Maybe not everybody, I'm not a huge fan, but for the most part, everybody eats bananas. You're familiar with bananas. Bananas, if I decide, say, I want to figure out how to make this banana get ripe real fast so I can make banana bread. Well, I can put all the bananas in there and kind of tie a paper bag around it and kind of force it, and I can test to see how fast that goes. Well, if those bananas are, if I just leave one on the counter and compare it and see how that basically gets old and kind of turns brown and gets mushy for banana bread versus using a different process, I can see if that process is actually effective and be able to see the difference. So that makes sense with everybody. So this is how experiments work, and this is important. So let me kind of walk through. So this came from a resource called Teacher's Pet. I don't know, but it was a good diagram. So basically it's very simple. You're going to take an experiment. What you do is you take that experiment and you break it into 2 groups. You have your control group, which it should come from the same sample. The control group is not going to change. The experimental group is going to change. Of that experimental group, you're going to then take that and say, what is something that is going to be that independent variable, those things that I can observe, and of that you can take your dependent variable and figure out what can I alter, and of that I'm going to see when I alter it or do something to it, what qualitative things can I observe with it and what quantitative things can I observe with it. I hope that makes sense. That was a real quick crash course in the scientific method. I'm getting some weird looks, but that's it. Yes?
They do that with medications.
Mm-hmm.
The control group, they're given a placebo.
Or a sugar pill oftentimes.
Or a sugar pill, where the experimental group, they actually give them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, these work with lots of types of science,
Yeah.
but lots of kinds of science they don't. So,
What do you mean lots of types of sciences they don't?
well, you're not going to do that for historical geology, for instance.
Well, we're going to, now you see where I'm going, geologist.
Well, it doesn't.
You don't have a control sample.
Smartest man in the room realized where I was going. All right, so scientific method definitions, right? Very important to understand. We have a hypothesis, and this is basically a possible explanation for what is tested. What I think will happen. And that's it. So oftentimes we'll use the word theory, but no, it's that in English terms might make sense, but really what we're talking about is hypothesis, which is what do I think is going to happen if I no longer feed my dog? How is my dog going to react, right? She's going to get very, very clingy and let me know that she's hungry, especially since she's on a diet. She's really not happy about that. So, but what I think is going to happen. Then you have something that's called a law. Now this is, a scientific law is a statement that describes what is an observable occurrence in nature that appears to always be true. We would refer to this as what is happening. So what is happening? So basically I can look at something and I could say, okay, I know that if I take this chemical and I put them together, this happens. I know every time, because I can test this over and over and over again, I can take 2 chemicals. That's another great example. Someone just dropped a pen. I can take a pen, I can hold it up and drop it. And every single time I hold it up and drop it, it's going to go down. So that is something that I can observe. Now, what am I observing? The answer is, I don't know. I just know that I'm observing it, and that's how the law would state it. A theory is a well-substantiated explanation acquired through the scientific method to repeatedly tested and is confirmed through observation and experimentation. Why is it happening? So if I take that pen and I drop it, and every time it hits the ground, I can repeatedly over and over again know that the law is that if I take it and drop it, it's going to fall. Why? What we call that is the theory of gravity. And so,
It's the law of gravity.
what?
It's the law of gravity.
No.
Yeah.
The law is that there's a theory of gravity and there's a law of gravity. What is happening is what can be measured. That would be Isaac Newton's formula, very easily that you could put in there. But the theory is going to be why do I think it's happening? And so you can Google it. There is a theory of gravity. There's a law of gravity. And what's the difference between those
Well,
two?
Google says it must be.
Well, I also go off people and scientists that I've been listening to for the past week. So,
Well, I heard this, that gravity has different attractions at different heights.
absolutely it does.
So we have this theory of gravity at, say, sea level, and then you have the theory of gravity on a mountain
So.
or the edge of a cliff, and they both differ.
But
So here's the important things. Let's move away from gravity since that's maybe a little bit harder to comprehend, right? Theories are oftentimes hermeneutics because what happens is we take observable data that we can see and we try to make sense of it. And so we try to make sense of it by testing it over and over and over again. And oftentimes what happens is people oftentimes refer to this as law, where really it's still just theory. So it takes some level of faith to believe the why, if you will. So some theories that have been around for long periods of time that eventually have broken down and been disproven because for a long time some of these things were basically believed to be 100% true. This is the way the world was. And so let's talk about this. How many of you remember spontaneous generation when you were in biology class long ago? So, way back when, back in the 1400s, 1300s, the way it was believed that life just kind of spontaneously came to be. And so what they did was scientists started testing this. And what they would do is they would take like a bunch of hay and some clumps of rags and everything like that, and they put them there, and miraculously mice would just come out of that. And so therefore, that's how you brought about life. Another one was if you left a piece of meat out, meat would spontaneously create life. Maggots would just come out of nowhere, and this would cause flies, and this would be spontaneous generation is what it was referred to as. And this was a theory because this is what they could measurably observe, and then eventually, and basically considered, this is the way the world works. Until all of a sudden it didn't. Until all of a sudden some people started figuring out biology, the microscope was invented, we started being able to look closer at cells, we started recognizing that life has cells, and from life cells come cells, and this is how this whole generation process comes from. So another one is alchemy. We talked about this, the whole idea of purifying things to create a new metal of some sort like that, right? For thousands of years, alchemy was a science. It was a theory in which that you could take something and derive gold from it, or derive silver from it, or derive something from it. And this was basically, it was kind of the early stages of what we might refer to as chemistry, but not the case. Something, I don't know if you ever heard of this, tabula rasa. Tabula rasa was called the blank slate. What was believed is that when a person was born, that they were born with a complete blank slate, and whatever environment you expose them to, is that what they would turn into. Well, that has been disproven because they realized that even through genetic code, what's passed along from one generation to the next, you are, no matter how hard you try, you're always going to be like your parents. It's just the way it is. And a lot of that has to do with, so there's some genetics involved. Now, is there a nurture component to that nature? Yes, there is. However, for a long time it was believed it was just a nurture thought process and not a nature process. And realizing that there's both. That has been debunked. This one I know a little bit less about, but I thought it was really interesting, and here, you'll understand my process here. Lumiforious Ether. So basically, it was thought that there is some sort of substance out there in the world that filled up the middle spaces of the world and the universe, and this is how light traveled, was through this substance. Well, then along came Albert Einstein, and Albert Einstein said, well, I got this theory of relativity, and I've also done all this light with refracted light and some other things, and basically disproved that to be absolutely, just debunked it and said this is the biggest load of gobbledygook there is. And so Albert Einstein revolutionized physics, which was thought that, and everything was based around this whole thought process of what we call Lumiforious Ether, and basically then as a result. Now, Albert Einstein, considered the smartest person in the world, right? Really interesting. One of the theories that he came up with, again, he's debunking theories. He came up with one that basically believed that the universe is static. Well, his theory of a static universe has been debunked. We know that through the laws of entropy that the universe is actually moving and continuing to spread and move apart at these times. And so it's really interesting that even the smartest man that's probably ever been alive, or at least that's how a lot of us think, even he's having theories that are debunked. But for a long time, this was considered something to be absolutely true because of this. And so as a result, what happens is, you have this thing where it's believed to be true. And so how many people were out there going, if I just put all these rags in the corner, I can create mice, right? And the people would do that thinking that would be the case. And then scientific would come, the people would continue to test. Well, it's better if I put rags with maybe leftover food on them or something like that. And all of a sudden more mice are coming. And you have these whole processes that are being thought of how I can take advantage of this, when really at the end of it, your whole thought process has been wrong all along. So, again, it all comes back to how you approach things and how I approach. If I approach the world from a standpoint saying that I view that everybody is just completely nurtured, and then I find that that my foster child, who I got from day one of birth that I adopted, all of a sudden now is showing characteristics of their parents, their biological parents, and I'm sitting there going, they've never been exposed to this, how can this possibly be? It starts to kind of go with that. And so I might, if I'm not thinking that, I might not be completely unaware of behavioral things. I hope that kind of makes sense. That one's a little bit out there. But this is how we approach things matter. And this is what I want to make clear. That even as we look at the scientific world, again, it comes from how am I approaching things. And I think that's very, very important. So, that brings us to young earth creation. I've talked a lot about this to get to this point. So what is young earth creation? Young earth creation believes a literal 24-hour a day, 6-day creation. Meaning that there are 6 24-hour days, and this is how God kind of set up and created the earth. Now, young earth believes that most young earth people believe that the earth is about 6,000 years old. To be considered in this camp, you have to believe that the earth is no older than 10,000 years to be considered a young earth creationist. So they believe in a literal interpretation of Genesis, which is very, very clear. And so there has to be, and the reason for this is we talked about their hermeneutic. Their presuppositions, their preconceived notions that they're bringing to the table. Oftentimes, I don't know many young earth creationists who are not Christians. And they approach it from the standpoint, I haven't met any, so if you've met some young earth creationists.
Definitely not.
Yeah. In fact, anyway, I don't want to ruin my own argument here, so I'm not going to.
Don't go there.
You almost got there.
Let's just say, if you research the origins of young earth creationism, you're going to be like, what? But anyway, so it came from a prophet. Hell no, I said, see, I'm messing up my own thing. Anyway, it originated from a prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the 1800s.
Modern young earth creationists.
Yes, modern young earth creationists. So, in fact, most of the early church fathers actually probably believe something closer to the gap theory. So there you go. I'm ruining my own argument, but let's move on in life. So, with that said, they believe in a literal interpretation of Genesis. They believe that death did not happen before on earth before sin entered the world. So let me read to you Romans chapter 5, verse 12. because this is an important verse for them, because they'll point to this and they say, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. And so it's very important that death spread as a result of bringing in...
To man.
Yes, to man.
Wrong.
It
Yes.
doesn't say to animals.
Yes. However, but basically, most of the young earth creationists will point to this verse.
Yeah,
And their hermeneutic and their approach to it will say that death did not exist on earth until sin happened.
But this verse does not prove that.
I'm just telling you their hermeneutic. You have... You
Just because it
have
doesn't
fun.
prove it
I'm
doesn't mean
setting
they
you up
might
for
not
next
use it
week.
as their
Steve.
argument. There's a lot of people who use verses to prove
All right.
something that doesn't
So-
read there.
So this is so here's the thing. This is what they believe. They believe that death did not happen, and the way to make sense of the world is this, and they believe in this literal interpretation. Because their worldview is going to be one of that everything has to fit neatly packaged into the Bible. So they're going to look at the Bible first to interpret science, where someone else might look at science to interpret the Bible. It's all about approach, and I want you to hear this, because again, it all goes back to hermeneutics and how you're going to approach your interpretation. Because right now, I'm approaching it from a biblical inerrancy standpoint, and therefore, a young earth creationist is going to kind of line up this way. Next week, you're going to hear from a geologist who is an inheritance of the Bible, but he will approach it from a scientific mind and try and say, how does science prove the Bible? And so he's shaking his head. He'll explain it all better than I will next week. Anyway, moving on. So how do we get 6,000 years? So the way we get 6,000 years is that from the creation of Adam, what you'll have is, and hopefully you can see this well enough on your on the screen here, is that you have on day 7 or day 6 of creation, Adam is born. And Adam is born, he lived 930 years. And then you have Seth, who was born, and then so on and so forth. And basically, by the time you get to, as this thing calls, says Israel, basically that would be, what's it called, Jacob. That basically you're looking at 200, he dies at 2,315 years after Adam is created. So if you're counting years, we count those many years. And we put, there's a line in here, this graph comes from Answers in Genesis, and so the flood is they put at 1,656 years after the creation of Adam. So how do we get to the world is 6,000 years old? Well, what you do is you look at the Bible and you start counting from Adam. That puts you, when you get to Jacob or Israel, you get to 2,315 at his death. And so basically, how do we get to 6,000 year old? From Abraham to Jesus. And again, we start being able to look at archaeological records and everything from the Bible to be able to point to different people and names that are mentioned. And we can start pointing and say, okay, we have basically a proven ideal that is basically about 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus. And then we have about 2,000 years from Jesus to current day. And we know that from our archaeological records. So we're looking at the way they count is the earth is about 6,000 years old. That's how they get there. So that's what young earth creation is looking from a very biblical standpoint and looking at this and saying, I'm going to count the years, and every day, if creation is a 24-hour period, and then every year is counted, and we count through and everything, that we get to the earth being 6,000 years old. And so then what they do is they try to fit the science into that. So here is a couple. There's a lot of evidences that they'll turn to here. I took the ones that I thought were the most compelling. For what it's worth, let's kind of look at these. So number one, evidence for a young earth creation. What they'll say is there's very little sediment on the earth floor. So every year, 20 billion tons of dirt and debris erode into the ocean near continents. So just from windstorms, rain, things coming out of rivers and everything like that, you get sediment, you get about 20 billion tons of this. So if you look around the continents, you'll see the average thickness of this sediment to be about 400 meters, or basically 1,300 feet deep. At the current rate of 20 billion tons, at the current going into the ocean, at the current rate, 1,300 feet of sediment would accumulate after 12 million years, not 4.5 billion years. I'm going to stop there for a second. I explained that fast. Do you all understand the argument? So basically, when you think about it, when it rains, all the dirt and debris and everything goes into your drain and somehow eventually ends up in the ocean, right? That's the Finding Nemo thing. All drains lead to the ocean. And so of that dirt and debris, everything that's deposited into the ocean ends up getting there. And of that dirt and debris, the estimates are 20 billion tons of that. And if 20 billion tons of that would get into the ocean, then at the current rate, it would only take 12 million years to build up. Does that make sense? But according to an old Earth creationist or a scientific creation, or someone who would believe the Earth to be 4.5 billion years, basically look at this as a factual inaccuracy. That this can't be the answer. Well, how do we answer this, what seems to be something that doesn't make sense? Well, Noah's flood makes a lot of sense. What they would say is that basically Noah's flood caused a whole bunch of water, and then this whole bunch of water receded, and therefore because of this one event, that whole bunch of water would come up, it would take a lot of sediment down, and therefore this is one of the evidences that you would have to say that this is how this all the sediment, because they're looking at it from a 6,000-year-old standpoint. How do they get all that extra stuff? Well, it's because of Noah's flood. Does that make sense? Yes?
Does that include the 40 million tons of space debris that hits Earth every year?
I would imagine so. I don't know. I don't know. So.
Now, I'm trying to understand this. You're saying that sediment from the continents fill the earth?
So,
the seas?
Say this is the water right here.
Yeah.
So basically what you have is you have the continental shelf,
Yeah.
and then you're going to get that drop off into the ocean.
Yeah.
So they're saying that of all this runoff, you get your debris right here. And the amount of debris is basically, this is 1,300 feet. And they're saying at the rate that we can measure, it should be, was it to get this amount, it should only take 12 million years. But if you're approaching it from an old Earth standpoint, then that debris level should be whatever this is times 12 million, whatever 12 million divided by 4.5 billion is
That whole continental shelf now moves up to sea level.
that is the argument, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So now you do have plate tectonics that work into this, but what they say is about 5% of this gets sucked back into the earth. Again, that's what the argument is. It's always very nerve-wracking when you're trying to make an argument that you just read about with a geologist in the room. So we'll see what questions come out of this.
It's interesting with even in saying at the current rate that the average thickness right now is already 1,300 foot. So that already kind of debunks the Earth is only max 10,000 years.
Well, no. What they would say is because this amount is because there was a major event in which there was a major runoff, which was this was not sea level, but because of the flood, this was sea level.
Yeah, I think it's still the debunk.
Okay, I'm just.
I don't.
It's
I'm not
okay.
on it, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. About 10 years ago, a doctor. So basically, the question then becomes: how do you find soft tissue in fossils? So Dr. Mary Schweitzer took a T-Rex skeleton that was found in Montana, and she took the thigh bone and she began to cut off slices to look under a microscope. When she looked under a microscope, what she saw surprised her. What she was expecting to see was rock because it's a fossilized bone. Instead, she saw evidence of bone marrow, red blood cells, blood vessels, collagen, and began to test this and everything and look at these things. Now, how do blood vessels survive in something that's supposed to be 68 million years old? So, the thought process is, if a dinosaur died in the flood, then it'd only be about 4,000 to 5,000 years old. If you map that with some of the mummies that we can get that are 3,000 to 4,000 years old, and then also if you look at the Tyrolean Iceman, who is estimated to be about 5,000 years old. How do you say it?
Tyrolean.
Tyrolean,
That's
thank
how
you.
I pronounce it.
That's how I do it.
I'm going to go with you because first time I read about it was earlier yesterday or today. I don't remember when. So I remember the Iceman though. I remember hearing about it. I just don't remember what it's called. So anyway, basically that the Tyrolean Iceman and the Egyptian mummies, which the Tyrolean Iceman would be about the same age as, say, a dinosaur that died in the flood, and that obviously had blood vessels and different things of DNA that we could see and look under a microscope. So what do you do with this dinosaur bones that's supposed to be fossilized? How does these biological structures still exist and have not been turned into stone? So another argument, questions. I honestly, if you have an answer, I honestly don't know. So, but this is one of the arguments that would be for this. So.
Steve, are they able to carbon date bones?
Dinosaur bones, no. I mean, carbon dating takes you back, say, 50,000 years. So what you're doing is they're using radiometric dating stuff, but it's a different elements and stuff. But you can radiometrically date them back into the millions of
Just
years.
curious. Just curious.
Oh, I can't wait to get to that part of the presentation.
Now let me say this is probably the most common argument that I hear online and stuff from people. And I've got some friends up in Dallas who are promoting this and stuff. Well, friends, they're friends on Facebook. Let's put it that way.
Friends?
Yeah, they're
Colleagues.
Acquaintances.
Colleagues.
Yeah, I would say, and we have some differences of opinion. But they have an institute in the Dallas area that's they find some neat things in this dinosaur. I don't think it's a problem from my standpoint, but they have different opinions.
So here's another one. Evidence number 3. This one I'm really nervous about. Was it presenting in front of a geologist? We'll see how this one goes. Helium does not combine with other atoms. If you remember correctly, I did take chemistry, so I do know that. so as a result, so it's a noble gas. It does not combine with it. So one of the things they did is they took geologists took zircon crystals out of Mexico. And what they found is that these rocks had high levels of uranium. These would be typically used to the process of uranium to lead. Was it radiometric? Was it break down your half-lives and everything? And what they found was, as they were testing this, they found large amounts of helium. So the interesting about helium is because of the size of it, it easily diffuses out of rocks into the atmosphere. And so the question then becomes, how do these rocks still have helium in them with their large amount of zircon in them? Because these rocks would have been formed with massive amounts of heat, and that heat should have caused all the gas to escape in the process. So helium, and then if this rock has been sitting around, the helium should have leaked out 100,000 years and it should be gone. And what they're pointing at is basically saying that even though these rocks that they're dating to be billions of years old should not have helium in them. So this is one of the arguments that they use. I'm open to the geologist and his interpretation, or maybe you can just talk about it next week. I don't know.
I mean, zircon it's a very tight mineral. That's why we like zircon. It's very stable and stuff that way. And stuff. So its crystal structure is really tight. But yeah, some probably did diffuse out, but you're generating helium all the time by the radioactive decay. So I mean, there should, if there was none in there, that would be very surprising, I think, to me.
But the very high levels is what they'll point to, saying that there shouldn't be such high levels.
Well,
Anyway,
You're saying that uranium breaks down to lead and helium?
This is-
helium is a product of the decay along the chain. I forget at what point it decays out and stuff, but you know, you could. But what you do in radiometric dating in uranium stuff is you'll measure the lead and a particular type of lead and the uranium, and the ratio of that should correspond to the age.
well, we'll get there. I have pictures to help you understand
Okay.
it. It's after this slide. So the fourth reason why they would point to a young Earth creation and some evidence for this is basically what they call the rapidly decaying magnetic field. So the Earth's magnetic field is caused by the molten metal core that shields us from the sun's radiation. Magnetic field is decaying about 5% per century. They started measuring the magnetic field back in 1845. It's believed that the Earth, so for this to be the case, and you use this as a quantity that we're measuring, right? 20,000 years ago, if it's decaying at this 5% per century, if you go the opposite direction, yes, if.
Yeah.
But that, mark my words, Steve, because that if will come back to haunt you here in a second.
Okay.
If it is a constant rate, then basically what we're talking about is that 20,000 years ago, the magnetic field would be so high that there is no water. The heat from the magnetic field and the heat from the molten core would be so great that it would basically boil all the water, and there's no way to have a liquid water on Earth. Everybody kind of track the way that I got there. So, saying that we know this thing, we can measure this thing, the electromagnetic field, it's the thing that gives us the aurora borealis and all these other things, we can track this. And what we notice is that it's decaying. If we go at the current rate that it's decaying, and we go reverse, that 20,000 years, all the water would boil off the Earth. That is the thought process. No water, no life. How does this all fit? Therefore, we go back to that young Earth. If it's only 6,000 years old, then you don't have this decay rate. The decay rate doesn't really matter and everything. The interesting thing is older scientists have had a real hard time explaining this. And so what they've done is they've come up with a theoretical dynamo model, is what it's called, or how I heard it referred to, which basically is that it's not that there is decay or that it's cooling, but actually it is basically the whole idea is this whole magnets are being rubbed together in the same way. If you imagine when you had your a light on your bicycle back before LED batteries and everything, you could just keep them on for long periods of time, but you had to have something that would be on your wheel that would, when the wheel would spin, and as a result that wheel was spinning, that would cause that light to come on. And so that's what they refer to as what this. The problem with this is that it's very theoretical and it hasn't really been proven adequately, in my opinion. And so again, it comes to this whole idea of theory. Remember how I went back to that whole idea? It all goes back to how you view the earth, how you view the world. Are you coming at it from a 6,000 year worldview, coming out of the Bible and trying to use everything and have science? You're using the Bible to explain science, or are you trying to use science to explain what you already understand? And so here we have this whole theoretical dynamo model. It very well could be the truth, but it very well may not be. But here's the thing, now we have this whole level of science being taught and being built off something that's very theoretical and honestly has a lot of problems.
But I would have to point out that the observations, if you test the magnetics in lavas, you can tell which way is north, for instance, on that stuff. In other words, every lava, but it has flipped in the past. So in other words, we basically know that the rate has not been constant for all of that time. In fact, it's actually flipped with time, many times in the past.
When in my lifetime, magnetic north was in Canada, now it's in Siberia. It has moved.
Okay, it does move. Yeah, I mean, and that's sort of what's happened. That rate, if you had you're making the assumption that the rate stays the same, but we have a lot of observations to say that it actually has changed at times.
They stole.
So let's look at radiometric dating. So radiometric dating calculates the age of geological material by measuring the presence of radioactive elements. You take samples from a rock that are measured, the number of what they call parent atoms against daughter atoms, or isotopes in this case. So if you look at this whole little diagram here that I got, the whole idea is the red things are the parent isotopes, and what we know is scientifically we can prove this, we can measure it, this is absolute truth. Do not think I'm one of these crazy people who don't believe in this, but we can absolutely observe and measure that decay rate of what we would call half-life of these radioactive material would go from, go radioactive to here, and we can measure this time frame in which they do this. So you have the parent atoms or isotopes, the radioactive decay, they would yield these daughter ones. So think about it this way, right? Uranium. You have uranium. Uranium is radioactive. It is eventually going to decay and decay into lead. Depending on what isotope it is, it depends on what type of lead it is, but this is what we can measure and what we can see. And what we can see is we know the half-life of this. Very important to kind of understand. This is how radiometric dating happens. So what you do is you take a rock, and I don't know, what do? You drill into the rock exactly? I mean,
Well, yeah, there's different ways and stuff like that, because now you can do it on tiny grains and stuff.
Yeah,
way.
so-
Basically you're doing a chemical analysis of it to know what's in there.
So you're doing a chemical analysis to find and you identify how many, and so what you do is you count how many isotopes you would have of the parent isotope, and then basically it's basic algebra. You would subtract maybe divide. I don't know. I do theology. I don't know. You all know the math though. Anyway, so you get the parent, and so basically that's how you would figure out the difference in how many years. I think that's a fair assessment of how to explain radiometric
It's
data.
kind of basic, yeah.
Okay, it is kind of basic. That's where we're going
That
to go.
works.
I got a question. We assume, or the theory is that uranium or radium turns into lead and something else. What? I'm having difficulty. Are we saying that lead never existed?
No, okay, there's different isotopes of lead. Now there is common lead, which exists, and that's what most lead is and stuff, but there's another isotope of lead. You know what, okay, an isotope, let's say says that, for instance, you got the same number of protons and stuff, and it's all lead, but if you have different numbers of neutrons in them, that's a different isotope. Okay, so certain isotopes we know formed by radiometric, from a radiometric decay, and common lead is different than that.
So,
that's a different isotope.
But common lead existed before.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely so.
Yeah. So like one of the real popular ones that's used, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is I think it's potassium, and it's decay into argon. Is that correct?
Yeah, there is. That's one method.
Yeah, and from what I understand, it's one of the very popular. Well, I mean, you correct me. I've never been in the lab. You have, so I'll take your word for it. Anyway, so so here's the thing with this is my issue that I've never had properly explained to me. Now, I also put an issue that someone else had on there that I do not have. Let me just be clear on that, right? So all the daughter atoms are derived from their parent atoms. So here's the thing. If you take the sample of a rock and you say, we have these atoms in it, and we know that they decay to this. But here's the thing. Remember I went back to that whole scientific method? That whole idea of having a control group. One of the things that we cannot have, and we're basing off assumption, is that every parent isotope, or every daughter isotope comes from a parent isotope. Does that make sense? So, going back to this whole hourglass thing, right? You have all these little guys up here. And then you have these guys right here. So if I start counting these and counting these, I come up with the age. But that's assuming that every single one of these came from one of these. Does that make sense?
That's my argument.
What?
That's my argument.
Well, so this is the problem I have, which in my mind, that's not good science. I just, from my basic biology that I learned, when I was in a lab, if I was going to look at these things, how do I know? There's no way of knowing how many. And so what's happened is a lot of the geologists go in with the assumption that all these things come from this. So the other thing is assuming that no contamination has happened. Now there's different viewpoints on this, but basically, can different atoms penetrate different rocks? So zircon crystals, as you heard, are very, very hard to penetrate, but not impossible. One of the things we know is that water is actually really great at transferring uranium isotopes around. And so here's one of these things that we have, is that we assume that there's no contamination. Here's the problem again. There's no way we can guarantee that there's no contamination of these products or what we're testing. So again, you can't really have a good control sample because your control might already be contaminated that you're working off of. There's not really a good control because there's no way of knowing how many of these things. The other thing that you'll hear some people argue, I'm not so sure I buy this, but is that we also assume that there are constant decay rates of these atoms. Now, I would be more inclined to believe that there are constant decay rates. However, there are some arguments, some of them poor, some of them are quite persuasive, that would say that maybe, and we'll go back to what I said to our resident geologist in house when I say be careful of your if, right? Because what I said was if we look at the electromagnetic field, if it's at that constant rate, we're also assuming that these half-lives do not fluctuate. There's a lot of these things that we don't know, that maybe there are different factors over the course of the years that we weren't around looking at these rocks, that it could have somehow affected how fast these things will decay. So the problem is none of these assumptions are provable because there is no control group. That is my argument. This is one of those things that is just, for me, I find very hard. Now, I will say this. There are also different ways of measuring age of things other than radiometric, radiometric dating. So I didn't look in all those because I just didn't have time. Because again, this is not my field. I'm not a geologist. I'm just a pastor. So that is my presentation to you on one of the things where I say, so often again, we base a lot of science off of assumptions in the same way we base a lot of what we believe about the Bible based off assumptions. And there's nothing wrong with having those hermeneutics, is we need to recognize what hermeneutics we are approaching with. So, with that said, this one I thought was real interesting. I know I'm running late here, but real quick, so one of the things we do is if you look at the formation of rocks, one of the best times to look at formation of rocks is when rocks are actually formed. And when are rocks formed? At volcanic blasts. And so one of the things they did was they used the potassium to argon radiometric dating on these known volcano eruptions, right? So we look at the Huanalani, I don't know if I said that right. I don't know what basalt is, but it's a type of rock from Hawaii. And basically, they did this radiometric dating of this, and they said that it was 1.4 to 1.6 million years old. Now they took rocks that came out of a different volcano at Mount Etna, the basalt in Sicily, and this would be estimated at 122 BC, and those rocks came out to be 250,000 years old. Another volcano eruption in 1792 at the same one, those rocks came out to be 350,000 years old. Mount Laysan in California, I don't know what this rock is called, Plagioclase, I don't know. How do you say it?
Plagioclase.
Plagioclase. Thank you. I was actually really curious. 1915. Again, this rock we should know is only been formed, should only be about 110 years old. 105 to 110 years old, and basically it will test and come out as 110,000 years old. We have the Sunset Crater Basalt in Arizona. Again, the estimate is that it erupted in 1064, 1065, and these rocks should be about 1,000 years old, they come out to be 250,000 to 270,000 years old. So, I'm just saying there's something going on here, and I haven't heard a good argument as to why these things are happening. Because if this rock is being formed, then we should be able to point to when it's formed, and that radiometric dating should line up. My point is this, is that radiometric dating may not be all what it's cracked up to be. So, I'd be curious to know what a counter-argument would be to this.
I have a simple question. You know, we talk about half-lives. Why are half-lives not all the same? I mean, different elements have different half-lives.
Yeah, each one decays at a different speed. Each decay change on that comes down, and there's a whole chain that gets you like from uranium to lead and this type of thing, and from potassium to argon as well. Now, this is where they're making the assumption that the geologists wouldn't make, that all of the argon in these modern lavas is the result of that decay, and that's not what the geologist is going to do, because he recognizes the fact that modern lavas will have a lot of argon in them and stuff as they come up, but that is going to diffuse. So if potassium argon becomes useful in older rocks after that first argon that came up has diffused away. But there are other argon, what they call argon methods and stuff, which will give you pretty precise dates on a lot of these things from within the uncertainty. So I mean, you know, they seem to work.
So like I said, I didn't see any evidence for that. So, but you're the expert, not me. So it all comes back to hermeneutics, because every theory, scientific or otherwise, comes down to it takes a little bit of faith. And so I took one of my favorite movies, if you never recognize Morpheus, and there's a famous line in the movie where Morpheus says, "Your mind makes it real." And so often the real problem, the real issue is this, is that I want to believe what I am going to believe. It doesn't matter how many facts you put in front of me, sometimes I'm going to cling to my faith no matter what. Or whether it is in science, or whether it's in Jesus, or whether it's in whatever it might be. Your mind makes it real. And I think it's really important to recognize that no matter what the case is, I think there's enough questions that we can kind of question some of the scientific model, saying maybe the Earth isn't 4.5 billion years old. I think there's plenty of evidence that would suggest that maybe the Earth is not 6,000 years old. The question comes down to this, is that what are you willing to believe, and how are you going to approach your belief of this? And I think it's very important for us to understand that, because it's all about the approach. For me, I can be fine with the Earth being 6,000 years old. I can also be fine if the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It doesn't really bother me. But for some people, it might really matter, because it might be contingent upon your faith. And I think that's very important for us to kind of recognize that so often when we kind of approach this. I want to close by actually reading the Bible. This comes from Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 23. It says this. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have clearly been perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." Verse 21 is where I'm at right now. "For although they knew God, they did not honor him or give him thanks, because they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, exchanging the glory of the immortal God for the images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." What I mean by that is this, is so often we as people like to think that we have all the answers, that we are smart enough, that we are capable enough, and really that's what comes back to what original sin is that we want to be God. And there have been some incredible thinkers, incredible scientists, on this earth who have been able to understand God in ways that most of us regular people will never understand. With that said, there are different ways of kind of how you're going to approach this, right? If you're going to approach this and say, I don't want to believe that there is a God, and so the easiest way for me to believe that there is no God is that everything happened by random chance and all this stuff was created by happenstance, and therefore I can go about living my life how I want to because I don't have to believe that there is a God who is going to visit judgment upon me. And oftentimes in the scientific community, in the limited time that I have spent in it, this is what I have found, is that people want to live in their worldview, and they are happy to live in their worldview. I remember sitting, I've used this illustration before, but I remember sitting in a biology class. And I remember sitting in this biology class, and I was talked to about the fossil record. And so one of the things that came up as we kind of talked about it, that showed up, was that the bone structure that is in the foot of the elephant, the only thing remarkably close to it, is the bone structure in the hand of a raccoon. And because of this, the question is there, how did this bone structure end up in two completely different animals? Well, the belief is that there is some common ancestor that we have not yet found the bones of, and it takes a level of faith to believe it. One of the things that the human eye is one of the miracles of biology. There's nothing like it at all except in a squid. The squid eye and the human eye are two amazing creations of God. But how do our evolutionary lines split long ago? So where is the common ancestor there? Or is the odds that the fact of the matter is this, is that so often what it really comes down to is what do I want to believe? And then I'm going to surround myself with science or an understanding of the world that I want to believe. Whether that is the world is 4.5 billion years old or whether it is 6,000 years old. Some people like me, doesn't really matter. Because God is sovereign and He's going to be there at the end. For some people, though, especially in the scientific community, it matters a lot. And so for them, they might look and they say, there's no way that the earth is 6,000 years old. But you know what? I don't know. None of us know conclusively, because to get to these conclusive things, we have to make assumptions. Whether in the scientific field or whether it is in the 6,000-year-old Christian worldview. And I'm okay with making assumptions because we don't know what the answer is. Because we have to come at it with some assumptions or some hermeneutic. And that hermeneutic for me comes from one that I believe that there is a divine creator. Now, that is my kind of stance on this all. Hopefully I gave you a reason to believe that the earth is actually 6,000 years old. Again, I'm not so sure I can cling to that and claim it. At the same time, I don't believe the earth is 4.5 billion years old. So next week what you will but I think the important thing is this, is that for Christians, we can still believe and fit our worldview into what we believe. With our hermeneutic, we can still approach God and still have faith in Him. Now next week what you're going to do is you're going to hear from someone who has a less traditional Christian worldview. So for what it's worth, and so but at the same time it still all fits and all works and God is still sovereign. So that's it. Are there any questions or comments? I hope I did a good job setting up next week.
Personal thoughts?
Yes.
The young earth theory of that it's a 24-hour period, I feel is biblically debunked because you don't know what that time was during that time of from Genesis through that time, because people lived to be 130 years old, but they didn't say what that time. We didn't have a standardized timing at that time. So,
How did somebody live 930 years? That's the one I'd like to hear.
yeah.
Well, he would have lived longer, but the flood came along.
So if you want the biblical answer to that, the biblical answer will come out of Genesis chapter 6, which basically God recognizes and say we have a problem. And our problem is that we still have this crossover where we have these basically fallen angels are
are.
Well, yeah, we don't know.
Yeah.
Well, no, the whole idea is that these fallen angels are having relations that are causing with the women of the earth to cause these beings to live longer, and so God kind of puts a squash to this. So,
But that's way after, you know, it's after the time of Methuselah and all this stuff.
No.
Before you
no, it's Genesis chapter 6.
Yeah, but Methuselah
The sons
was
of
5,
God.
right? Genesis 5. Right?
What? So basically, what you'll see is that all of a sudden it's basically right around that time of the flood.
Oh, that's right before the flood.
Yes.
Yeah,
And what you see is lifespans all of a sudden become shortened. So anyway, for what it's worth, there's a biblical answer for that. From a scientific standpoint, I've got no idea. In all honesty, it really doesn't ruin my faith very much, but it's an excellent question. And I think that's the important thing for us to remember, right? For some people, they need to have this question answered for them to believe. And I'm sure there is an answer out there. But you're right, sometimes it could just be very much an excuse because they don't want to put their faith into it.
But they ought to be able to believe that you're going to put all your trust in something that is reasonable.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think there's an important aspect to it, and I can't remember the verse off the top of my head, but basically says that, I think it comes out of Hebrews, it says that we're supposed to work out our faith with fear and trembling. Maybe not Hebrews, I can't remember where that's from. But I think that's something to be said for the fact that what we're supposed to do is God has called us to reason this out. God has called us to basically make our faith our own. And to make our faith our own, we need to wrestle with these hard questions. We need to think about these questions. We need to kind of to work through these things. And I think that's a very important thing, because working through that might bring you to say that Earth is 6,000 years old and you can be happy and content to live in that worldview. Who knows what the actual answer is? You can wrestle with that and be like, there's no way I can believe the Earth is 6,000 years old. But I tell you what, I can wrestle with this and I can see that Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and I can live peaceably knowing that God created this Earth over 4.5 billion years.
I live in the camp of I don't have to know all the answers, but I trust the one who has them.
But I think that's important. But again, what is your hermeneutic? You come from a Christian worldview where you believe the God and you have faith. For someone else, that is an incredibly difficult thing that they can't overcome.
Takes a whole lot more stress off of my brain for trying to have to figure it out.
For you, yes. For you, yes. Someone else might be, I can't get past this because it can't reconcile it. If I can't reconcile it, then that pulls a thread and everything I believe about God falls apart.
That's happened for a lot of people.
And so I think it's a fair thing. Again, when it comes down to it all comes down to hermeneutic. It all comes down to what you believe and how, and your preconceived notions into all these things. Like I said, I think some of the science can get a little bit sketchy when it comes to dating the Earth. I think there are some things that we take for granted because there's no way to create a control group. I also think that 6,000 years is a stretch because a lot of emphasis is put on magical things that happen because of the flood. And I have a hard time reconciling myself with that. At the same time, there are plausible things on both sides. I don't know what's to be said. I'm destroying my whole argument here. As you can tell, I'm not a 6,000-year-old Earth guy. At the same time, though, there are some things. Now, yeah, so we'll stop right there. We'll stop right there.
I can deal with 7,000.
I draw the line at 7,500.
Well,
Do we have 8?
I might be able to do 20.
We'll be cooked alive.
Are there any other questions?
Well, the end of the world is coming. You know that, right? No.
Yes, it is.
Any other questions,
Yeah,
comments? All right. Well, let me pray for us. Lord Jesus, Heavenly Father, I thank you so much that you have given us science, Lord God. That you've given us a way to comprehend and understand your creation, Lord Jesus. Lord, I pray that this is not a stumbling block to anyone, but rather, Lord God, that this is something that people can be encouraged with and continue to work out their faith and understanding about your world, Lord God. Lord, I don't know what the answer, and Lord, if you would give it, I pray that you would give it to us, Lord God, exactly how old the earth is. Lord, I pray for all those who have a hard time and difficulty with how old the earth is, Lord God, and that this becomes a sticking point for them to understand and believe. And Lord, I pray that you would help us recognize and understand the struggle that people have, Lord God. And let us work out our faith, Lord Jesus, so that we might be able to lead others to you. Pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen.